I'm Bill Kassel, and this is Free Expression. This program is all about conveying the Christian message from a Catholic point of view and defending the liberty which makes it possible to do that. We talk with creative, interesting people about a Massachusetts law that might allow mothers to sell their children and censorship practices that could end the internet as we've known it. Join us, sit back and enjoy some free expression. Back in the 1980s, a friend introduced me to the internet. He was a retired military officer who had gotten into computers, and he was excited about something he called bulletin boards. These were sites where people could post messages for others to read online. My friend thought this system would revolutionize our politics through increased citizen participation. People could exchange information or organize groups to promote various causes. It would be a tremendous boost to freedom of speech and grassroots democratic action, and for a while it looked like he was something of a prophet. In fact, we've become more dependent on the web than even he could have expected. But those projections about freedom of speech and grassroots action haven't unfolded in quite the way he assumed. Jeffrey Tucker is founder and president of the Brownstone Institute for Social and Economic Research. We've spoken with him before, and he recently wrote an article for the Epoch Times in which he described how the internet is being brought under a measure of control and restriction that would have shocked my friend back in the 80s. Jeffrey, thanks very much for being with us again.
Sure, and I appreciate your intro very much. It was very good and very accurate. I held those views too. Sometime after 1995, I became a convert to the idea of digital commerce. I was a true believer that it was going to democratize information, make us wiser and more wonderful, and it was going to open up new opportunities, economic opportunities for the world. Really, I think I came to the belief that it was going to change everything.
But something happened along the way. It was the Wild West for a while. Anybody could say anything they wanted, but that changed.
Well, the strange thing about it is, I appreciate your term Wild West, but it wasn't that wild. I mean, it was free, but it was strangely orderly. The people, it became self-ordering. I would say by about 2010. That was the iPhone was invented. I guess Facebook was open. We had a lot of social media platforms doing a lot of different things. There wasn't any real censorship. And yet, the app economy began to develop because Apple opened up its iPhone to new developers making new tools. And so it was actually quite wonderful. And it was not dominated by anybody. Yes, everybody was there, Wall Street Journal, CNN, MSNBC, Google, but there were other search engines. And there were no real monopolists. There was a sense that you had in those days that this was free and open, and it was always going to be that way. There's a kind of a permanent record of humanity's experiences, and the internet would help us get to become freer and, access more things. And everybody was doing it. Every religion, every cause. And it seemed there was a great deal of optimism in those days. And there were various manifestos, published, Declaration of Internet Freedom and this sort of thing. And, the innovation was quite beautiful and fantastic. Obviously, that has all completely changed.
Yeah, I would say with the 2020 election and then followed hard on by the COVID incident, we really became aware that information wasn't being distributed as freely as we had anticipated. It's
happened sort of gradually and then all at once.
Yeah.
If you look before 2020, we saw ever more consolidation, so that it ended up that the internet in general was dominated by 4 to 6 companies. And Zuckerberg was gobbling up Instagram and WhatsApp. Google was gobbling up everything. Amazon was gobbling up everything. And it became ever harder to start an online business, much less make a profit with it. And that became a serious problem. And so the new innovations were glad to sell to the large companies. But it just led to ever more consolidation to the point that you just had a handful of companies controlling everything. Then it became very easy for government to then get its hooks into the online world, into the digital world through a variety of little means. You get third-party cutouts, foundations, grants. A major part of it was just simply that governments began to contract with Amazon and Google and Facebook for so many services that became a major, major customer of the now consolidated companies. And so under capitalism, the customer is always right. Well, what happens if the government is your biggest customer, as it is at Microsoft, at Amazon, and so on? Well, then you start having to pay attention to government. So when they tell you, do you need to censor this vaccine information? Do you need to tell everybody to wear masks? Do you need to do all these various things? Then the companies are far more likely to listen. And indeed they did. So as a result, we experienced a very different internet than we did 4 years ago. And one of the most obvious points here is that your Google searches are no longer giving you the consensus of users on the internet. The Google searches give you what somebody thinks you should know. It's a very different algorithm.
It would seem like these companies, being in the communication business, should operate according to the rules of the communication business, all of which fall under the First Amendment. How is it that these outfits have assumed that they have the right to step in between people and control the flow of information?
I think that most of these companies are just trying to survive, and they don't pay a lot of attention to things like the First Amendment. There's a whole generation of tech employees who don't care anything about the Bill of Rights and Thomas Jefferson and whatever happened in the 18th century. They don't care. It's unfortunate, but with the 21st century digital age, it bred a whole generation of tech entrepreneurs, coders, rich people who came to believe that a new world had dawned and they didn't need to pay any attention to the old world at all. With that comes a lot of strange views that we're going to merge machines and humans, that's the so-called transhumanism. And anyway, the First Amendment's not really anything that they think about or care that much about. So, when COVID hit, Mark Zuckerberg immediately wrote Anthony Fauci and said, we're at your service. Whatever you want us to do, we'll do. Not everybody was that deferential and obsequious, but most all the top tech titans were ready to start cracking down on what they call disinformation. Well, what's disinformation? It's opinions that powerful industrial players in league with government don't like. That's what disinformation is. And so that came to be the thing that was censored the most. And we have a lot of experience with this, but, vast amounts of documentation that it was a kind of what we've been calling the censorship industrial complex at work.
Right, and there are very elaborate structures, organizations like NewsGuard, for instance, that put tremendous pressure on advertisers and companies themselves.
NewsGuard is an interesting case because, one of the problems that if you're going to be a censor, if you're going to block information, one of the major problems you have is that advertisers like platforms that everybody is reading, everybody's watching. That's where you want to advertise. So to discourage advertisers from going to the places with information you don't like, meaning that you have to get advertisers to do things that are contrary to their commercial interest. Mm-hmm. That's a tough proposition. NewsGuard serves this purpose of sort of vetting venues for credibility and then passing on the list to large corporations, Condé Nast, IBM, and if you end up being listed as a bad guy, then people won't advertise with you.
Right.
I have to add to this, though, that NewsGuard is about a lot more than just advertising, actually. They hound me all the time. I run Brownstone Institute, which is a nonprofit. We don't accept any advertising. There's no reason for us to be examined by a NewsGuard, but they stay after us, all the time. And now this is being investigated because, of course, NewsGuard is funded in part from a grant from the Department of Defense. So it is a form of censorship. It's of a particular sort that's invaded our advertising space. And let me just give you one example so your listeners can understand what I'm talking about here. Before Tucker Carlson was taken off Fox News, he had by far the highest rated news television show in the English-speaking world, if not on the planet Earth, by far. By far. It was twice, 3 times, 4 times, 5 times as large as the number 2. But if you think back to what his advertising looked like when he was at Fox, he only had a couple of advertisers. One was MyPillow,
right,
and then another was a nonprofit that gives help to veterans. Those were his 2 main advertisers, but you didn't ever see any advertisements for large car manufacturers, beer companies. Either the normal ads you would see on CNN, MSNBC were never there. Now, why might that be true? Lots of eyeballs, a lot of demographic that's buyers. You would think that companies would want to advertise on Tucker Carlson. They simply would not. So this is an early sign that something was broken in the advertising realm.
Well, this has become obvious now. A lot of people are becoming aware of this government/corporate partnership that is inhibiting the flow of information. There is a case called Murphy versus Missouri, which has been working its way through the courts and which the Supreme Court recently issued a ruling about. Perhaps you could give us some insight into what that's all about.
The case started to be litigated, I guess, some 2 years ago. And during that time, there's a lot of information coming out that showed exactly what I just laid out, that there's very extensive contacts between government officials, third-party cutouts, and tech companies like Twitter and Facebook and so on. And that was demonstrated so many times over that when the judges started gathering information for the case, the judge was so alarmed at what he found, he said, this is going to lead to mass censorship if this continues. So he issued what's called an injunction, which is an order to force government agencies to stop doing this. And he listed a number of them, CDC and FBI, and there's a whole list of agencies that he ordered to stop this. And the Biden administration appealed that decision. So that landed in the Supreme Court. So what happened in the Supreme Court the other day is that the court declined to enforce the injunction on the technical grounds that the plaintiffs don't have what's called standing to stop agencies from blocking future harms immediately. In other words, pre-trial. Essentially what happened is the court gave a green light to the agencies to keep going with all their projects and their censorship and keep distorting information structures and taking over the internet. However, the case itself still has to be heard. And so it'll be in court 2 or 3 years. We might end up with a good judgment on the other side of this. It's hard to say for sure. My concern is that by that time, in 2 or 3 years, everything on the internet will be moderated not by people, but by artificial intelligence.
Right.
And these artificial intelligence engines will just operate on their own. Nobody can control them. They're already pre-programmed to get rid of opinions that are contrary to what government and large industry wants. It's a major problem. So by the time, even if we get the best possible ruling, the battle might already have been lost in 2 or 3 years.
Well, now there have been other players who have entered these markets. There's a search engine called Brave Search. There is a social network called Gab. These groups are supposedly supporting free speech. At least they're presenting themselves as the free speech alternative. Do you have any hope that the market can correct itself by other people getting in, spotting this opportunity and seeing a market that needs to be served?
I would say my hope is very thin, and I'll tell you why. Google monopolizes 97% of all Internet searches. The rest is dominated by Bing and a couple other things. Something like the Brave browser is less than, I would say it's 0.1% at the highest. So it's a very small player. Gab, small Substack accounts. There are these other players out there, but they just constitute a very, very small amount of the market. They're very tiny. If they grow, then that's when you're going to start seeing the agencies start to lean on them and tell them to shape up. Then they have a problem to face. So every business faces this at some point. Do I comply or die? And unfortunately, if you're a business and you're responsible for a lot of employees and and you want to survive to the next day, the typical answer is they're going to comply. So I don't really see a way out of this, actually. I pretty much think the internet is going to become, in a few years, kind of like the television in the 1970s, 2 or 3 channels, but we'll replace the 800 numbers you used to see on the screen with online ordering, from Amazon or whatever. But apart from that, there might be a few pockets of dissent here and there, but I don't see it changing. My recommendation to everybody listening is that you immediately find your community, find the people who embrace your values right now, subscribe to their email lists, stay in touch with them, watch what they say, reformulate your life, and follow your heart rather than follow the dominant players out there. I think that's the only way we're going to survive this.
In a sense, that goes back to my friend back in the 80s with his bulletin boards. Back to the future, as it were.
Kind of. Yeah. I think it's going to get pretty bad, and it breaks my heart because so many people are victims of this. They buy their phones. Their phones come pre-installed with certain apps. The apps are preset to blow up their phones all the time. People without knowing find they're in a position, CNN's telling them what to think all the time, and they're not really aware of how to turn it off or pursue other options. I think it's very deeply sad. But unfortunately, I feel like the momentum is not with the people who want more freedom. I think the momentum is really with the other side.
Well, where can people find out about the Brownstone Institute and your work?
Yeah, I post quite frequently. I run brownstone.org, and I recommend that everybody go there and sign up for our email list. We send 1 email a week because it's really the only way we can stay in contact with you. We control that list, and we don't share it with anybody. So just remember, over the coming months, especially as we approach the election, and whatever happens to the election, this pressure is going to continue over the next year, 2, 3, or 4. Your options for finding out information are going to narrow rather than broaden. It breaks my heart, but that's the world in which we live right now.
A gloomy prospect, but I guess that's where we are right now. Jeffrey Tucker of the Brownstone Institute, thanks very much. Good to speak with you again.
Such a pleasure. Thank you.
Surrogacy has always been a topic of controversy. That's the practice of having a woman carry a baby to be given over to someone else at birth. Some people see it as an act of great humaneness, the ultimate pro-life gesture, if you will, an answer to the problem which many women have of carrying a child to full term. Others see a pragmatic side, a way for poor women who are healthy but have no marketable skills to earn money or at least be supported for a while. The Catholic Church has always condemned surrogacy as unnatural and exploitive, but the practice is generally accepted as legal, though carried on under conditions that are closely regulated. Now, Massachusetts is pushing these legal boundaries with a bill which some critics say will turn babies born through surrogacy into simple commodities, mere products to be put up for auction. Patience Griswold represents a children's rights organization called Them Before Us. She recently wrote about this Massachusetts legislation in an article for The Federalist, and she's here to explore this difficult topic. Thanks so much for speaking with us.
Thank you for having me on.
How does surrogacy normally work, and what has changed under this new law?
So usually in a surrogacy agreement, what's happening is a couple contracts the woman to carry their child, and that child is either, the embryo is either created using their sperm and eggs, donor sperm and eggs, or a combination of the two. Then that agreement, depending on the laws and the contract that they enter into, can either be an altruistic surrogacy agreement where no money is changing hands aside from reimbursement for medical expenses, or a commercial surrogacy agreement where the woman is being paid to carry that pregnancy for the couple. Under this Massachusetts bill, they would additionally be legalizing genetic surrogacy. So in a genetic surrogacy contract, the mother is using her own egg. So the child is not just the child that she carries via pregnancy, but also the child that she is genetically related to. And this bill is unusual in that it would be legalizing commercial genetic surrogacy. So a woman would be allowed to accept money in exchange for a child that is genetically related to her.
So this is a woman who can instigate the pregnancy by herself and then essentially sell her child.
Yes, so there's a particularly concerning line in the bill that says as long as all parties agree, the surrogacy contract can be validated after the surrogate mother has already begun the assisted reproduction process. So it creates this loophole where hypothetically you could have a woman go to a sperm bank, get pregnant via artificial insemination, and then post on a surrogacy forum saying, hey, I'm available as a surrogate, and also I'm already pregnant. And then she could choose to match with the couple that's willing to pay the most for the child that she's carrying. So it really is an alarming bill that is legalizing baby selling under a different name.
Yeah, it would seem on the face of it that this is sort of analogous to slavery in that you're putting human beings up for sale. How does this pass constitutional muster, or maybe it doesn't?
And since it hasn't passed, it hasn't faced a constitutional challenge. But basically, the advocates are doing this semantic gymnastics where they're saying that parentage is now based on intent. So it's not based on the biological bond anymore like it has been throughout history. And it's not based on adoption, which is an institution that's established for the sake of the child involved, a child who's endured loss and is now being placed with parents for their protection and for their nurturing. Instead, it's saying that parentage is based on the intention of the adults involved. And so what this bill is doing is it's giving the courts the right to validate these agreements and saying that because the contract was in place, it doesn't, according to their argument, count as baby selling, even though that functionally is what they're doing.
It may seem sort of silly, but if you extend this in a kind of logical way, doesn't this open the door to people just selling their children?
It potentially does. So the bill would require that, like the example of the woman that I gave who gets pregnant and then starts a surrogacy agreement, it does stipulate that she would have to use assisted reproductive technologies for that. But yes, it does open the door to people accepting money in exchange for their biological children, which is really alarming, especially considering the ways that surrogacy laws have been exploited in the past. In 2011, there was a baby selling ring in California that was broken up by the FBI, and they were violating California's surrogacy laws, but they were able to operate undetected for years because California law allowed for parents to be listed on a child's birth certificate without going through the adoption process and without being related to the baby. And after that baby trafficking ring was broken up, the FBI issued a statement reminding the public that a surrogacy agreement must be in place first. What this bill is doing is it's opening the door to creating surrogacy agreements after the fact, which comes with all sorts of potential for abuse.
Yeah. Do you think this will stand? I assume there will be court challenges.
I don't know. It is expected to pass the Senate and to be signed into law by the end of July. I think that it certainly deserves to be challenged in court, and it shouldn't hold up. But in order to be challenged, someone would have to bring a case to the courts challenging it, which means that the harm would have to.
Yeah, and then you have questions of standing and all of that. Generally speaking, these kinds of social innovations come from the West Coast, and in this case, it's the East we're talking about. But do you think this will have influence in other states?
I think it absolutely will. At Them Before Us, we monitor this kind of legislation. We make sure that we're equipping people on the ground who are running up against these bills. And I've worked with groups in multiple states that have seen surrogacy bills just, since the beginning of this year. And a couple of those states are expecting to see more. legislation in the near future. There's definitely a push for more of these surrogacy bills, especially bills like this one, it's called a parentage equality bill. So in addition to legalizing surrogacy, it's also legally redefining parentage. And that's being framed as something that's needed in order to advance equality for LGBT family structures. And so I think we're going to see a continued push for this kind of legislation.
Well, your organization, Them Before Us, is certainly keeping its eye on these startling changes. Tell us a little about your work and how people might learn more about it.
Them Before Us is focused on putting them, the children, before us, the adults, and focusing on the ways that children's rights, needs, and well-being are being sidelined by adult desires and ideologies, especially in the wake of the sexual revolution. So we deal with topics like surrogacy, and also more broadly, ways that the family structure has been redefined and marriage has been redefined in ways that harm children. You can get involved with our work by following us, thembeforeus.com. We've got an option to sign up for our email list there, and you can also connect with us on social media. We would love to keep your listeners in the loop on ways that children's rights are being harmed and ways that children can be protected.
Patience Griswold, Them Before Us. Thanks for taking a couple of minutes and talking about this. This is a rather frightening prospect, this thing that's just taken place. I'm glad you guys are keeping an eye on things and ringing the alarm bell.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on.
Don't forget to support your local Catholic radio station. In this time of censorship and so-called cancel culture, Catholic radio is becoming increasingly important as an alternative media source. Our programming is based on the Word of God and the teaching of His Church, and we bring you the factual, truthful information you aren't getting from the mainstream media. Support Catholic radio. Your generosity keeps Catholic outlets on the air, and donations to broadcast ministries can be tax deductible. Urge your friends and relatives to tune in as well. Be with us next time when we explore other aspects of religious communication and look deeper into the great Christian heritage of free expression. Free Expression with Bill Kassel is a production of Good Shepherd Catholic Radio and Company Publications, where good books, good music, and good radio are always good company. Dan Curris provided technical assistance. Theme and incidental music are by Dan Adam. The program was produced and directed by Bill Kassel. This is Good Shepherd Catholic Radio.